I'm now joined by author of the new book, Lawless, Leah Litman. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So you have just written this book all about the Supreme Court, and I want to get into that in a moment. But right now we're at a moment where the Supreme Court's supremacy, its autonomy, is being challenged. It handed down a unanimous ruling demanding the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was illegally deported to El Salvador. Donald Trump has opted to defy that Supreme Court ruling. So first and foremost, do you have confidence that the Supreme Court is actually going to go to the mat and stand up for itself as this process plays itself out, if Trump does indeed refuse at the end of this line to facilitate the release of Garcia?
No, I think the Supreme Court kind of laid the groundwork for what we are seeing now when they gave the executive branch some wiggle room in that Abrego Garcia opinion. Because what they said is the lower courts can order the executive to facilitate return, but they cannot order the executive branch to actually effectuate, i.e., bring about return. And so part of the fight that is happening in the lower courts is whether the administration has basically done enough to fulfill its obligation to facilitate return. For example, they said, look, state asked Bukele to send back Abrego Garcia, and they said no. So we tried, and that's the end of the matter. And the Supreme Court's opinion in Abrego Garcia also directed the lower courts to act with due regard for the executive branch's power over foreign affairs. And of course, now the executive branch has invoked the state secrets privilege to basically try to block any discovery into what they have done to facilitate return. So I'm not confident that the Supreme Court is going to actually go to the mat to bring Abrego Garcia home. I am hopeful, and I think the amount of public attention on the case is a good step to making that happen, but I certainly am not confident.
Invoking state secrets is quite funny, considering this is the administration that was basically creating deportation porn by showing the whole process of deporting these people into CCOT.
Yes.
And now suddenly they're saying, well, we couldn't possibly reveal any information because that all falls under the category of state secrets. That's just
Right.
to the side. But more broadly, doesn't this imperil, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court's own autonomy? I mean, they are supposed to be a co-equal branch of government. And so what do you presume the rationale for these? I mean, this is the majority of this court is conservatives, but aren't they basically surrendering their autonomy, their supremacy over to the executive branch and making it so that no longer is the Supreme Court some co-equal branch of government, but basically that they are subsumed by the executive branch?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of a tricky situation. One is there are clear historical instances where the Supreme Court has basically balked in the face of an executive branch or the prospect of political officials not complying with their court orders. If you think back to in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, after the Supreme Court declared segregation illegal, they followed it up with a decision that said, well, all schools have to do is act with all deliberate speed to integrate. And that gave
Nice and
school
subjective.
districts exactly a lot of wiggle room to actually draw out the process of integrating because the Supreme Court was worried that they actually wouldn't comply with their decisions. Famously in Marbury versus Madison, when Chief Justice Marshall announced that the Supreme Court has the power to actually strike down federal laws, the bottom line of that decision did not order Thomas Jefferson or Secretary of State James Madison to do anything because the Supreme Court was worried about whether they would comply with the decision. So the Supreme Court has balked repeatedly when it is worried about whether the executive branch or other political officials will comply with their decisions. And then the other thing I would say is, yes, the Supreme Court is worried about their own power, but the Republican justices have been very pro-executive power when a Republican is the executive. And so I don't know if they will take quite an affront to this as they did when Joe Biden did the tyrannical thing of trying to cancel student
Cancel student
debt.
loan debt, right, God forbid.
Exactly.
So is that basically a tacit admission that because there is no enforcement mechanism connected to the Supreme Court, that indeed they are kind of conceding that they are a lesser branch of government than the executive, and so they're just trying to preempt some public display of their own subservience by instead watering down these rulings with words that give the executive branch some plausible deniability when they inevitably don't comply?
So Alexander Bickel famously called the federal courts the least dangerous branch, in part because they don't actually have the power to enforce their own judgments. But that is part of why it is so awful that the Supreme Court has basically destroyed its own standing in the eyes of the public, because
Right.
part of the Supreme Court's legitimacy and power derives from public support. and the
Right.
public believing that the court is actually engaged in law rather than politics. And because the court has squandered that capital over the last 5 years, 10 years, they are left in a situation where they do have considerably less power vis-a-vis the executive branch.
Right. With that said, we do have another major Supreme Court case coming up, and that is the Birthright citizenship case. This should be plain as day, black and white. I mean, it is prescribed right there in the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. And yet, we have seen this Supreme Court either concoct out of whole cloth provisions of the Constitution that don't exist. We have the presidential immunity clause or provision that they decided to insert in there by fiat. And then we do have provisions that do exist that the Supreme Court has decided don't count, like the 14th Amendment, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which would have prevented Donald Trump from running for office again because he gave aid or comfort to those who've incited an insurrection. And so, again, as it relates to birthright citizenship, it is right there in the Constitution, but do you have confidence even still that this is a Supreme Court that would uphold the plain text of the Constitution, or would they be more deferential to Trump?
I'm so happy you brought up the immunity case and the case allowing Donald Trump on the ballot, notwithstanding his participation in the Stop the Steal movement and January 6th insurrection, because I think it's the combination of those two rulings that laid the groundwork for the Trump presidency and also emboldened Donald Trump to actually try to eliminate provisions in the Constitution like birthright citizenship. Where did he get the crazy idea that he isn't subject to the 14th Amendment or that the
Right.
president is above the law? Let's think about that. So here, the president and the federal government have actually not asked the Supreme Court to rule on the legality of the executive order that strips birthright citizenship. Instead, they're basically relying on some procedural technicalities, asking the Supreme Court to say that the lower court rulings should only apply in those states that opted to challenge birthright citizenship, thereby allowing the administration to implement the birthright citizenship executive order in largely Republican-led states that opted not to challenge the executive order. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that even this administration knows this is a huge uphill battle even before the Supreme Court. I actually expect the court to reject the Trump administration's request, and I think they are going to see this case as basically an easy win for the Supreme Court and an opportunity for them to prove their independence from Donald Trump and Trumpism when they inevitably enable his agenda and greenlight some of his other policies later on.
Right. I mean, in a way, these opportunities are easy wins for them to just be able to say, look, we've reinforced our independence, our judicious,
Exactly.
Independent bona fides on something that is so plainly unconstitutional, so that it gives them more plausible deniability when they turn around and say, oh, but a president can also have a complete, immunity when it comes to committing criminal acts in office. Okay, so let's talk about your book, Lawless. Why did you decide to write it right now?
So the title of the book is Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. And I wanted to write the book to give people a sense for the political context, that is, where all of these doctrines that the Supreme Court was generating were coming from. I wanted them to see the extent to which the Republican justices are drawing from their own feelings and the talking points of the Republican Party to fashion the law that we are all ruled by, because I worry that we are at a moment where, as we were talking about with birthright citizenship, people will snap back to viewing the Supreme Court as just fine because they
Right.
are going to sometimes rule against Donald Trump, when 3 years ago they were basically condemning women to beg for their lives because they were being denied medical care and health care. So I think people need to have a different picture and be socialized in another picture of what the Supreme Court is and what it's doing.
And so how did that thesis bear itself out in terms of whether the Supreme Court was actually adhering to some strict interpretation of the Constitution, or just basically deferring to vibes and Republican Party just orthodoxy of the day?
Yeah, so I use the phrase vibes to draw a pointed contrast with what many people think of as law, which is something that is objective or determinate. And here, when Sam Alito is basically humming a few bars about his feelings in the pages of the U.S. reports, obviously that's not going to strike many people as law-like. And I wanted them to see the full picture and the extent to which the Republican justices are imprinting their own feelings and working out their feelings in the pages of the U.S. reports. And the singular theme that I wanted to unite these different areas of law together with is this idea of conservative grievance. Their sense that today, conservatives, Republicans, white evangelical Christians are the victims of a society that doesn't share their views. And more horrifyingly, deign to criticize them or call
Right.
discrimination discrimination or inequality inequality, and show the extent to which that worldview is animating areas of law that range from campaign finance to administrative law to voting rights and many others.
Is there any difference right now between the Supreme Court justices who sit on the court and Republican elected officials who might be elected to Congress or the Senate?
So there are some differences, just in the same way that there are differences in the elected Republicans who are in the House and in the Senate. Not all of the Republican elected officials are the same, but that doesn't mean they're not Republican or they're not Republican politicians.
Right.
And so that's part of the point I want to make in the book is that we can always find instances where Chief Justice Roberts is going to diverge from Justice Clarence Thomas. That doesn't mean they're not both Republicans, and it doesn't mean they're both not acting out Republican Party preferences. It's just that sometimes there is disagreement within the Republican Party about what they want the party to do and how.
Oftentimes we see this asymmetry between Democratic elected officials and Republican elected officials where, and you've heard the saying, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. It is very easy to see unison within the Republican Party, not so easy within the confines of a party that go from Joe Manchin to AOC and Bernie Sanders. And so are you seeing the same phenomenon present itself as it relates to the Supreme Court? Oftentimes we are seeing Republicans rule in unison. And so I'm curious whether you think that the Democrats are just as unwieldy as congressional Democrats, while Republicans often fall in line, or is it a little bit of a different construct at play?
I think it's a little bit of a different construct. I think one thing that is different is the Republicans have built a very well-oiled machine to select nominees who they know are going to aggressively use the law to help Republicans' interests. And they also have a system in place to effectively discipline the Republican appointees to keep them in line. That's the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. So what that allows them to do is basically signal to the Republican justices, here's what it means to be a Republican today. So that allows them to change doctrine. So several decades ago, the Chevron doctrine, the idea that courts would defer to administrative agencies, that was a Republican idea. But then the Republican justices overruled it because with enough programming, enough messaging, enough conferences, enough articles, the conservative legal movement could signal to the Republican justices, here's what we want you to do.
Right.
And then second, the Democrats just aren't appointing people who are going to, again, aggressively use the law to maximize and entrench Democrats' political power. That's what Republicans are doing, because for a party that depends on minority rule, they know they need the courts, and they need the courts to entrench Republicans' power. And so that's what they're doing.
I mean, objectively speaking, you cannot look at Joe Biden's appointment of Merrick Garland as AG and Donald Trump's appointment of first Matt Gaetz, but then Pam Bondi as AG and think that these two are in any way in the same universe. I mean, one really leans on the fact, used as a crutch, the fact that he could be independent and judicious. I mean, this is a DOJ that prosecuted the president's own son. And yet now you have a DOJ in place that wouldn't, that's actually refusing to sign on to prosecutions or indictments of Republican elected officials. So right there is kind of really the embodiment, the physical manifestation of exactly what you're talking about. Leah, how can we find your book?
So it is going to be out on Tuesday, May 13th, and you can pre-order it now. You can get it at your local independent bookstore next week. You can order it online. Bookshop.org supports local independent bookstores, and with the code STRICT24, you can get a discount at bookshop.org. So, please consider checking out the book. I had a lot of fun writing it. I hope people have fun reading it. All of the chapters have a pop culture motif that I kind of use to poke fun at the justices. So, the chapter on LGBTQ equality, for example, likens the Republican justices to the Mean Girls in the movie Mean Girls.
Yeah.
And chapter 1, which is about reproductive justice, likens the rise of originalism and the overruling of Roe to a Kensurrection, like from the Barbie movie. So, I did this partially to cut the justices down to size, but also to make criticizing the Supreme Court and Democratic left-leaning politics directed at the court fun, because it's going to be a fight that happens over the long term. We need to find a way to make it sustainable. And I think finding a way to make it enjoyable and fun is one way to do that.
Who's the Regina George of the Supreme Court?
Sam Alito definitely has the worst main character energy of anyone on the Supreme Court right now. This is the guy who famously or infamously said, you can no longer say marriage is between a man and a woman, even though he's literally been saying that for over a decade. And what
Yeah.
he means is when people say that, they are criticized, which
Right.
is the worst thing that could happen to a justice.
Well, again, for anybody watching, highly recommend you grab the book Lawless. I'll put the link on this screen and also in the post description of this video and in the show notes of the podcast. Leah Litman, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.